In the dead of night, beneath the frozen surface of the Arctic Ocean, an American submarine commander faced an impossible choice. Turn back to safety, or proceed into the most heavily guarded harbor in the Soviet Union, where detection meant certain death. This wasn't a Hollywood thriller. This was reality during the Cold War, when brave sailors ventured into the darkest depths of enemy territory on missions so secret, their own families would never know the truth. Welcome to the hidden world of submarine espionage, where American submariners became the silent spies of the deep, penetrating prohibited Soviet waters in operations that remained classified for decades. These weren't just reconnaissance missions. These were acts of extraordinary courage that pushed technology, human endurance, and international tensions to their absolute limits. The story begins in the aftermath of World War II, when the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the world's two superpowers. The alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany quickly dissolved into mutual suspicion and hostility. By 1948, the Cold War was in full swing, and both nations were locked in an arms race that would define the next 4 decades. The Soviet Union presented a unique intelligence challenge. Unlike Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan, the Soviets were masters of secrecy. Their borders were sealed tight. Their military installations were hidden behind layers of security. Traditional espionage methods, using human agents and aerial reconnaissance, could only provide limited information. What American military planners desperately needed was intelligence about Soviet naval capabilities, submarine technology, and underwater defenses. The answer came from an unlikely source. The United States Navy submarine force, which had proven so devastating against Japan during World War II, could be adapted for a new kind of warfare. Not combat against enemy ships, but silent infiltration into restricted waters to gather intelligence that no spy satellite or reconnaissance aircraft could obtain. These missions were given the code name Holystone, and later became known as various other classified program names. The operations were so secret that even within the Navy, only a handful of officers knew the full scope of what was being attempted. Submarine crews were told they were conducting routine patrols. Only the commanding officer and a few senior personnel knew they were about to enter Soviet territorial waters, sometimes penetrating harbors and coastal areas that were considered absolutely off-limits. The submarines chosen for these missions were modified with special equipment. They carried advanced sonar systems that could detect and record Soviet submarine signatures. They had cameras that could photograph underwater installations through periscopes designed for extreme low-light conditions. Some were equipped with devices that could tap underwater communication cables, allowing the United States to literally listen in on Soviet military communications. But technology alone wasn't enough. These missions required extraordinary seamanship and nerves of steel. Soviet coastal waters were among the most heavily defended in the world. Hydrophone arrays listened for any unusual sounds. Patrol boats constantly swept the harbors. Anti-submarine warfare systems were positioned at strategic choke points. One mistake, one mechanical failure, one moment of bad luck, and an American submarine and its entire crew could be captured or destroyed. The risks weren't just military. If a submarine was detected inside Soviet territorial waters, it could trigger an international incident that might escalate into full-scale war. President Kennedy, President Nixon, and every commander-in-chief during the Cold War authorized these missions knowing they were playing a dangerous game of nuclear brinkmanship. One of the most daring operations involved the penetration of Vladivostok Harbor, the main Pacific port for the Soviet Navy. Vladivostok was considered impenetrable. The entrance to the harbor was narrow, heavily mined, and constantly monitored. Soviet doctrine assumed no enemy submarine would dare attempt entry. That assumption was wrong. In the late 1960s, an American submarine, whose name remains partially classified even today, received orders to enter Vladivostok and photograph new Soviet submarine classes that intelligence analysts believed were under construction. The mission was considered so dangerous that the crew was given special briefings about what to do if captured. They were told to destroy all classified material and to reveal nothing beyond name, rank, and serial number. The approach to Vladivostok took 3 days. The submarine traveled submerged the entire time, moving slowly to avoid detection. The commanding officer positioned the boat at periscope depth only during brief periods when visibility was poor and Soviet patrol activity seemed reduced. As they neared the harbor entrance, the tension became almost unbearable. Every man aboard knew they were crossing a line from which there might be no return. The submarine entered Vladivostok harbor in the early morning hours, when Soviet watch crews would be at their least alert. The captain navigated using outdated charts and real-time sonar readings, avoiding known minefields by mere yards. Inside the harbor, they discovered what American intelligence had suspected. New Soviet ballistic missile submarines were indeed under construction, representing a significant advancement in Soviet naval capability. The submarine spent 6 hours inside Vladivostok harbor, photographing everything of military value. Then came the most dangerous part: getting out. Soviet naval activity had increased. Patrol boats were moving in patterns that suggested possible detection. The American submarine had to wait, sitting on the harbor bottom, while Soviet ships passed overhead. The crew maintained absolute silence. No unnecessary movement. No talking. Just waiting in the dark, wondering if the next sound they heard would be depth charges exploding around them. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the patrol boats moved to a different section of the harbor. The American submarine quietly slipped out the same way it had entered, and once clear of Soviet coastal waters, dove deep and ran fast for the open Pacific. The mission was a complete success. The intelligence gathered helped American naval planners understand Soviet submarine development and influenced U.S. defense policy for years to come. But Vladivostok wasn't the only target. American submarines also penetrated harbors in the Barents Sea, where the Soviet Northern Fleet was based. These operations were even more dangerous because of the extreme Arctic conditions. Ice coverage limited visibility and made periscope operations nearly impossible. The water was so cold that any mechanical failure could be catastrophic. Yet submarine crews continued to accept these missions, driven by a sense of duty and the knowledge that their intelligence gathering was crucial to national security. One particularly significant operation involved tapping Soviet underwater communication cables in the Sea of Okhotsk. This body of water, located between the Russian mainland and the Kamchatka Peninsula, was considered a Soviet lake. The Soviets believed it was so secure that they ran unencrypted military communications through underwater cables, never imagining that American submarines could reach them. The operation, later revealed to be part of a program called Ivy Bells, required a submarine to locate the cables on the seafloor, then deploy divers in specialized equipment to attach recording devices. The divers worked in near-freezing water at depths that made every movement exhausting and dangerous. They had to work quickly, in complete darkness, knowing that Soviet patrol boats were operating overhead. The recording devices they installed were technological marvels. They could operate for months without maintenance, capturing Soviet naval communications and storing them on magnetic tape. Every few months, an American submarine would return to the same location, retrieve the tapes, and install fresh recording equipment. The intelligence obtained from these taps was considered some of the most valuable of the entire Cold War. These operations continued for years without Soviet detection. American cryptographers were reading Soviet naval communications almost in real time. They knew about Soviet submarine deployments, weapons tests, and even internal discussions about naval strategy. The advantage this provided to American defense planners cannot be overstated. It was like playing poker when you could see your opponent's cards. The men who conducted these missions were volunteers, though many didn't fully understand what they were volunteering for until they were already at sea. Submarine duty during the Cold War attracted a special kind of sailor. Men who could handle the claustrophobia of spending months underwater in a steel tube. Men who could maintain absolute discipline under extreme stress. Men who understood that their service would never be publicly acknowledged, that there would be no medals or recognition, only the satisfaction of knowing they had served their country in its time of greatest need. Life aboard a submarine conducting espionage operations was unlike any other military experience. The boats operated under ultra-quiet protocols when in enemy waters. Machinery that could be shut down was shut down. Crew members wore soft-soled shoes to minimize noise. Conversations were conducted in whispers. Even the cook had to modify how he prepared meals, avoiding anything that required excessive noise. The psychological pressure was immense. These men spent weeks or even months at sea, never seeing daylight, never breathing fresh air, always aware that they were deep in enemy territory where capture or death could come at any moment. They couldn't write letters home. They couldn't tell their families where they were going or when they would return. Many marriages suffered under the strain of these repeated, unexplained absences. Yet the submarine community maintained incredibly high morale. There was a sense of elite status, of being part of something bigger than themselves. These sailors knew they were on the front lines of the Cold War, that their missions were preventing a hot war that could destroy civilization. That knowledge sustained them through the long dark hours beneath the waves. The close calls were numerous. One submarine conducting operations near a Soviet naval base was detected by patrol boats and pursued for 18 hours. The crew remained at battle stations the entire time, making constant course changes, diving deep, then rising to periscope depth, trying everything to shake their pursuers. They finally escaped by hiding near an underwater canyon, using the complex terrain to confuse Soviet sonar. Another submarine experienced a mechanical failure while inside Soviet territorial waters. A critical pump broke down, creating noise that could potentially give away their position. The crew worked frantically to repair the pump while the captain maneuvered the boat to put as much distance as possible between them and known Soviet listening posts. The repair took 6 hours, and every man aboard expected at any moment to hear the sound of Soviet anti-submarine weapons locking onto their position. Perhaps the most frightening incident involved a submarine that became entangled in Soviet anti-submarine nets while attempting to exit a restricted harbor. The nets were designed to trap submarines, and once caught, the crew had limited options. Using reverse propulsion risked creating noise that would alert Soviet forces. Cutting through the nets with external tools was slow and dangerous. The commanding officer made the difficult decision to slowly back the submarine out of the net, accepting the risk of detection as preferable to certain capture. It took 3 hours to free the submarine from the net. During that time, Soviet patrol boats passed within a few hundred yards. The crew could hear them through the hull, their propellers churning the water, their active sonar pinging across the harbor. But somehow, miraculously, the Americans weren't detected. When they finally cleared the net and escaped to international waters, the captain broke his usual stoic demeanor and admitted to his officers that he had never been more frightened in his life. These stories remained classified for decades. The sailors who served on these missions returned to port, went about their normal duties, and never spoke of what they had experienced. Their families didn't know. Their fellow sailors didn't know. The American public certainly didn't know. The full scope of submarine espionage operations against the Soviet Union only began to emerge in the 1990s, after the Cold War ended and some documents were declassified. Even then, many details remained secret. The exact number of penetrations into Soviet waters is still classified. The names of many submarines involved are still classified. The full extent of the intelligence gathered remains locked in government vaults, accessible only to those with the highest security clearances. What we do know suggests that these operations were far more extensive and more successful than anyone outside the intelligence community ever imagined. The technology developed for these missions had lasting impact beyond the Cold War. Advanced sonar systems, underwater communication tapping equipment, and specialized photographic systems developed for submarine espionage found applications in other areas of naval operations. The expertise gained in operating in contested waters proved invaluable in later conflicts and continues to inform submarine operations today. But the real legacy of these missions is human. The sailors who conducted submarine espionage operations against the Soviet Union demonstrated a level of courage and professionalism that deserves recognition. They went into harm's way, repeatedly, with no expectation of glory or public acknowledgement. They did it because their country asked them to, because they believed in the cause of freedom, and because they trusted in their training and their shipmates. Many of these veterans are now elderly or have passed away. Some never told their families the full truth of what they did during the Cold War. Others have shared limited details, though always within the bounds of what remains classified. When historians interview these men, a common theme emerges. They don't consider themselves heroes. They were just doing their job, they say, just following orders, just serving their country the way submariners always have. But make no mistake, what they accomplished was heroic. Every penetration into Soviet waters was an act of calculated bravery. Every hour spent hiding on the bottom of a Soviet harbor, listening for depth charges, required nerves most people cannot imagine. Every successful mission contributed to keeping the peace during the most dangerous period in human history. The Cold War could have turned hot at any moment. The United States and Soviet Union possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy human civilization many times over. The strategic balance, the concept of mutually assured destruction, depended on both sides having accurate intelligence about the other's capabilities and intentions. Submarine espionage provided crucial intelligence that helped American leaders make informed decisions about defense policy, arms control negotiations, and crisis management. When Soviet missiles were discovered in Cuba in 1962, American decision-makers had context for evaluating the threat because of intelligence gathered by submarines operating near Soviet facilities. When Soviet submarine technology advanced in the 1970s and 80s, American naval strategists could adapt their tactics because they understood the new capabilities through intelligence collected during covert operations. The submarine espionage program also served as a deterrent. The Soviets eventually realized that American submarines were operating in their waters, though they never fully understood the extent of the penetrations. This realization forced them to invest heavily in coastal defense systems, diverting resources that might otherwise have gone to offensive capabilities. It created uncertainty in Soviet military planning, never knowing for sure what the Americans knew about their operations. From a historical perspective, submarine espionage during the Cold War represents one of the most sustained intelligence-gathering efforts in military history. These weren't one-time operations. They continued year after year, decade after decade, through multiple presidential administrations and changing geopolitical circumstances. The institutional knowledge required to conduct these missions successfully was built over time, passed from one generation of submariners to the next. The training for these missions was rigorous. Submarine crews practiced ultra-quiet operations until they could do them in their sleep. They studied Soviet patrol patterns, harbor layouts, and defensive systems. They rehearsed emergency procedures for every conceivable scenario. And they developed the mental toughness required to operate under extreme stress in an environment where mistakes could be fatal. The chain of command for these missions extended to the highest levels of government. Operation orders were approved by the Secretary of Defense and sometimes by the President himself. The intelligence collected was briefed directly to senior policymakers. These weren't rogue operations conducted by cowboys in the military. They were carefully planned, legally authorized missions that served specific intelligence requirements identified by the national security apparatus. The legal and ethical dimensions of submarine espionage have been debated by scholars and policymakers. International law regarding territorial waters was less clearly defined during the Cold War than it is today. Both the United States and Soviet Union conducted operations that pushed the boundaries of acceptable behavior. The Americans justified their submarine missions as necessary intelligence gathering to prevent surprise attack and maintain strategic stability. The Soviets, when they eventually learned of the extent of American operations, protested vigorously while continuing their own espionage activities against the West. What's clear in retrospect is that both sides were playing a dangerous game. The risk of miscalculation, of an incident spiraling into conflict, was always present. That no American submarine was ever lost during these covert operations in Soviet waters is remarkable. It speaks to the skill of the submarine crews, the quality of American technology, and perhaps a measure of good fortune. Some of the closest calls involved interactions between American and Soviet submarines. On several occasions, American boats conducting espionage operations encountered Soviet submarines in restricted waters. These underwater encounters were nerve-wracking games of cat and mouse, with each side trying to track the other without revealing their own position. American submarine commanders had to make split-second decisions about whether to evade, to go deeper, or to attempt to outrun their pursuers. The Soviets had their own submarine espionage program, though it appears to have been less extensive than the American effort. Soviet submarines were detected near American naval bases, off the coast of major ports, and in areas where American ballistic missile submarines operated. The difference was that American coastal defenses and submarine tracking capabilities were generally superior, making Soviet operations more difficult and easier to detect. This asymmetry in capabilities was one reason American submarine espionage was so successful. The United States invested heavily in underwater technology during the Cold War. American submarines were quieter, had better sonar, and benefited from advanced computer systems that could process acoustic data in real time. These technological advantages gave American submariners a crucial edge when operating in hostile waters. But technology alone doesn't explain the success of these missions. The human factor was equally important. American submarine commanders were given significant autonomy to make tactical decisions during operations. They had to balance mission objectives against risk, knowing that they alone would be responsible for the consequences of their choices. This required judgment, experience, and a deep understanding of both submarine operations and the geopolitical context in which they were operating. The intelligence analysts who planned these missions also deserve recognition. They had to identify targets of intelligence value, assess the risks of attempting penetration, and provide submarine commanders with the information needed to navigate safely in uncharted or poorly charted waters. They studied Soviet defensive patterns, looking for weaknesses and opportunities. They developed detailed mission plans that accounted for weather, tides, Soviet patrol schedules, and countless other variables. Communication during these missions was extremely limited. Once a submarine entered Soviet waters, it typically could not surface to communicate with headquarters. The crew was on their own, sometimes for weeks at a time. Radio communications were too risky because Soviet monitoring stations could detect transmissions and use them to locate the submarine. This meant that commanding officers had to execute their missions based on pre-deployment orders, adapting to changing circumstances without the ability to request guidance or additional intelligence. The stress of this isolation cannot be overstated. Submarine commanders carried the weight of knowing that their decisions affected not just the success or failure of the mission, but the lives of their entire crew and potentially the relationship between two nuclear superpowers. One bad decision could start a war. The psychological burden of that responsibility was immense. Yet these men performed extraordinarily well under pressure. The success rate of submarine espionage missions was remarkably high. Most operations achieved their intelligence objectives without detection. The few times American submarines were detected, they successfully evaded capture and made it back to friendly waters. This track record is a testament to the professionalism and competence of the United States submarine force during the Cold War. As we look back on this era from the perspective of the 21st century, it's important to understand the context in which these missions occurred. The Cold War was an existential struggle between two competing ideologies, two incompatible visions of how human society should be organized. Both sides believed, with some justification, that the other posed a mortal threat. In that environment, intelligence gathering was not just desirable, it was essential for survival. The submariners who conducted espionage operations in Soviet waters were fighting the Cold War in the most direct way possible, by going into enemy territory and collecting the information needed to prevent a hot war. They weren't firing weapons or sinking enemy ships, but their contribution to national security was just as important as any combat action. Today, many aspects of submarine operations remain classified. The United States Navy continues to conduct missions that serve intelligence gathering and strategic deterrence functions. Modern submarines are far more capable than their Cold War predecessors, with better stealth, longer endurance, and more sophisticated sensors. But the fundamental challenge remains the same. Operating in contested waters, collecting intelligence, and doing so without being detected requires the same combination of technology, training, and courage that characterized submarine espionage during the Cold War. The lessons learned from Cold War submarine operations continue to inform current doctrine. The tactics developed for penetrating hostile waters, the procedures for ultra-quiet operations, and the training methods that produced such highly capable submarine crews are all part of the institutional knowledge of the submarine force today. New generations of submariners study the operations of their predecessors, learning from both successes and close calls. As more information about submarine espionage has been declassified over the years, the public has gained a greater appreciation for what was accomplished during the Cold War. Books have been written, documentaries produced, and veterans have finally been able to share some of their experiences. These stories have entered the historical record, ensuring that the contribution of submarine crews to winning the Cold War will not be forgotten. But many stories remain untold. Veterans are still bound by security oaths that prevent them from revealing certain details. Some operations remain so sensitive that they may never be fully declassified. Families of submariners who served during the Cold War often still don't know exactly what their fathers, husbands, or sons did during those long, mysterious deployments. What we can say with certainty is that submarine espionage against the Soviet Union was one of the most significant intelligence programs of the Cold War. It provided information that could not be obtained any other way. It demonstrated American technological superiority and operational capability. And it was conducted by men whose courage and dedication to duty exemplified the best traditions of naval service. The strategic impact of these missions extended beyond intelligence gathering. The mere fact that American submarines could penetrate Soviet defenses, could operate with impunity in waters the Soviets considered secure, had psychological and political effects. It undermined Soviet confidence in their coastal defenses. It created paranoia within the Soviet military establishment. And it demonstrated that the Iron Curtain was not impenetrable, that even in their most secure areas, the Soviets were vulnerable to American intelligence collection. This capability also influenced arms control negotiations. When American and Soviet diplomats sat down to discuss limitations on naval forces, the Americans negotiated from a position of superior knowledge. They understood Soviet capabilities in detail because of submarine espionage. This advantage helped secure agreements that were favorable to American security interests. The end of the Cold War in 1991 didn't end submarine operations in contested waters, but it did change the nature of those operations. Relations with Russia improved, though they remained complex. New threats emerged in other parts of the world. The submarine force adapted, as it always has, to the changing strategic environment. Looking back, the era of submarine espionage in Soviet waters stands out as a remarkable chapter in naval history. It was a time when technology, courage, and strategic necessity combined to produce extraordinary results. The men who conducted these missions wrote a secret history, one that is only now beginning to be fully told. Their legacy lives on in the submarine force of today, in the capabilities they helped develop, and in the tradition of excellence they established. As we conclude this exploration of submarine espionage during the Cold War, we should remember that freedom is not free. It's protected by men and women willing to go into harm's way, to serve in silence, to accept missions that test the limits of human endurance and courage. The submariners who penetrated Soviet waters during the Cold War were such men. They deserve our respect, our gratitude, and our remembrance. Their story is a reminder that the defense of liberty sometimes requires extraordinary sacrifices made in the shadows, known only to those who served and the God who watched over them. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the hidden history of submarine espionage.